Some of you may be familiar with the work of Frederick Jameson in writing about literature from the global south. He said that all novels from supposed third world countries were allegories for the nation. And so most obviously when you think of a book like Midnight's Children, the midnight referred to is independence, and the story that you read is the story of the nation. But in Amitav Ghosh's Ibis trilogy, Sea of Poppies, River of Smoke, and Flood of Fire, we see something far stranger, something larger, the spaces between nations, the spaces that make up the economy in the empire. This is a trilogy that's a rip-roaring sea tale, a potboiler with erotic intrigue, but it's not simply about India as the crown jewel of the British Empire, but about describing the political economy of Asia colonialism, home to half or two-thirds of the world. This is a novel series that spans from opium fields to the decks of ships, war fields, sugarcane plantations, auction houses, and bodice ripping bedrooms and boudoirs. We travel from Calcutta to Canton, Mauritius, Singapore, Hong Kong, all across the Indian Ocean as its own unit. The catalyzing frame, the event, is the First Opium War, and the three books follow us to kind of like the beginning of it. The Opium War serves as a kind of aleph, infinite point through which you can look and see the way that India and China kind of form symbiotic nexus of British colonial economy. To give some background, the First Opium War was essentially the British looking for a way to find China useful economically. And in order to balance the import-export relationship, they decided to essentially become drug dealers and flood the Chinese market with heroin. Eventually, the Qing dynasty was destabilized, 20,000 people were killed, and the British burnt down the summer palace of the emperor, stealing even what they believed to be the skull of Confucius. Reading these books, I was thinking about what Lawrence Levine called the unpredictable past. Reading these books, you learn that the Qianlong emperor wrote a book about Hindustan, that samosas are actually a food that originates in Xinjiang province, and that the oldest mosque in the world is in Huashan. You have this sense of irony of reimagining the past in a different way. The books are, in a way, you might say, the madmen of colonialism, or almost like an anthropological equivalent of science fiction. They might be the answers to questions like, what was Asia? What is a global literature? Or what is a literature that can be as global and as large as colonial capitalism? So let's give a hand to Amitav. So we're going to screen a brief video, and then we have a presentation.
Now, but was once one of the world's busiest ports. And Kolkata, or Calcutta as the city was then known, was the capital of Britain's empire in India and the hub of British military power in Asia. Calcutta is the point of departure for many of the voyages of the Ibis trilogy. The city was then, as it is now, a place of extreme contrasts. Some wealthy merchants built houses so opulent that Calcutta was known as the city of palaces in the 19th century. But the poor and destitute also flocked to the city in great numbers to seek a meager living.
During the years of the Raj, the British launched many wars, large and small, from Calcutta. My new novel, Flood of Fire, is about a war that has disappeared into the furthest recesses of memory in Britain and in India. The First Opium War of 1840 to 42, which was instrumental in shaping the world as we know it today. Of Calcutta's exports, the most important was opium. And the greatest beneficiary of the trade was Britain's East India Company. In Bengal, the company enjoyed a complete monopoly in the production and marketing of the drug, which it used to finance its enormously lucrative trade with China. The building in which the East India Company usually held its opium auctions was probably at this location. The informal market in opium futures, where vast fortunes were made and unmade in a single day, was in a lane like this one. The chief market for the East India Company's opium was China, which meant that a large fleet of ships shuttled constantly between Calcutta and Guangzhou, or Canton as it was known to Europeans. This connection brought many Chinese sailors, traders and artisans to Calcutta, and by the late 18th century there was a thriving Chinese quarter in the city. In today's Kolkata, the Chinese community has dwindled to a couple of thousand residents, yet traces of its past prosperity can still be seen in its temples and meeting places. A few members of this community figure in River of Smoke, the second book in the Ibis Trilogy. We meet them again in Flood of Fire. The Ibis Trilogy begins in the opium fields of Bihar and follows the migration of indentured workers to British colonies across the world. In this book, several characters from Sea of Poppies, Zachary Reed, a young American sailor, Neil Ratan Haldar, the former Raja of Raskhali, and Jodu, a young Muslim boatman, cross paths with Havildar Kesri Singh, who is one of the 4,000 soldiers who traveled to China to fight in the First Opium War. From the other end of the main deck, Kesri drank in the sights of the receding city, the temples, the houses, the trees, as if he was seeing them for the last time. As the city slipped past, a strange, cold feeling crept through him, and he realized with a shock that deep in his heart, he too had come to believe that he would never see his homeland again. One of the things I wanted to convey when I started writing the Ibis Trilogy was an aspect of Indian life in which stories and shared histories and memories connect generations over periods of decades and centuries. That's been the texture of my life. Knitting together generations through their shared stories, the Ibis Trilogy links the destinies of Calcutta and Guangzhou, India and China, a history of mutual destruction from which they are only now beginning to emerge. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you so much, Ken, for that very generous introduction. And thank you all for coming on this rain-drenched evening. So, Flood of Fire is set in the late 1830s and early 1840s, and the novel's central character is an Indian soldier or sepoy who is employed by the British East India Company. His name is Kesri Singh, and he's the brother of Diti, who some of you will remember from Sea of Poppies. Kesri Singh is a Havildar, or a sergeant, in the 25th Regiment of the East India Company's Bengal Native Infantry. This regiment is also known as the Pachisi, or 25th in Hindustani. The book opens with Kesri leading the battalion on a march through rural Assam in eastern India. As I read this section, I'm going to show a series of slides to give you a sense of what a mid-19th century sepoy regiment was like. These slides are taken from a panorama published by Ackerman and Company, a 19th century London publishing house. It was entitled Line of March of a Bengal Regiment of Infantry in Sindh, and it was published in 1830, so it is almost contemporaneous to the period of Flood of Fire. Kesri was the kind of soldier who liked to take the lead, particularly on days like this one, when his battalion was marching through a territory that had already been subdued, and the advance guard's job was only to fly the Paltan's colors and put on their best parade faces for the benefit of the crowds that had gathered by the roadside. Right behind Kesri's horse, following on foot, was the so-called Rasad Guard, the foraging party. Behind them were the camp followers, inaccurately named since they actually marched ahead of the sepoys and far exceeded them in number, there being more than 2,000 of them to a mere 600 sepoys. Their caravan was like a moving city, a long train of ox-drawn bailis carrying people of all sorts, pundits and milkwomen, shopkeepers and Banjara grain sellers, even a troop of bazaar girls, and then a platoon of scythe-bearing ghaskatas. To them would fall the task of providing fodder for the hundreds of animals that marched with the column. Behind them came those who would prepare the campsite, tent-pitching khalasis, flag-bearing thadniwalas, coolies with cooking kits, dandiya porters with poles slung over their shoulders, and of course cleaners and sweepers, meters and bangi-birdas. Next was the battalion's laundry contingent, a large group of dhobis and dhobins, with a string of donkeys laden with bundles of washing. Animals too there were aplenty, noisy flocks of sheep, goats and bullocks, and elephants and camels as well, carrying the officers' baggage and the furniture for their mess, the tables and chairs tied on with their legs in the air, wriggling and shaking like upended beetles. Then came Pagla Baba, the battalion's mendicant and mascot. Thin and tall, his joints were huge and gnarled, and his skin was smeared from head to toe with ash, as was his matted hair, which he wore on his head in a thick turban of coils. The English officers hated Pagla Baba, and not just because he liked to bring the blush to their cheeks by flaunting his impressive manhood. One part of the caravan was reserved for the camp-following gentry, the Brahmin Pandits, the Munshi, the Bazar Chaudhry with his account books, the Kayas Dubash, who interpreted for the officers, and the Bania Modi, who was the Paltan's banker and moneymonger, responsible for advancing loans to the sepoys and for arranging remittances to their families. There was even a traveling temple, trundling along atop a cart. After that came the jail party with its contingent of captured enemy soldiers, and then the mess train with its cartloads of supplies for the officers' kitchen, crates of tinned and bottled food, barrels of beer, demijohns of wine, and hogsheads of whiskey. This was closely followed by the hospital establishment with its long line of canvas-covered hackeries carrying the sick and wounded. And then the battalion's drummers and fifers, most of whom were Christian Eurasians and had entered the ranks through orphanages and poorhouses. Some of them were as young as 11 and 12. Only after all of this had passed would a rhythmic drumbeat make itself heard and a cloud of dust appear. The ground would reverberate in time with the beat as the first rank of sepoys came into view, 10 abreast, at the head of a long winding river of dark topis and flashing bayonets. The sight would send the villagers scurrying for cover. They would watch from the shelter of trees and bushes while the sepoys marched by, piped along by fifers and drummers. Few were the tamashas that could compare with the spectacle of the Bengal native infantry on the march. Every member of the Paltan was aware of this. Dandiyawalas, Nach girls, Bangi Bardas, Saises, mess consumers, Beriwalas, Bhishtis, but none more so than Havildar Kesri Singh, whose face served as the battalion's figurehead when he rode at the head of the column. Another major character in this book is Neel Ratan Haldar, the former Raja of Raskhali. In Sea of Poppies, Neel was convicted of forgery and sentenced to transportation, but he succeeded in escaping from the Ibis. In River of Smoke, Neel was in Canton or Guangzhou, living in the city's foreign enclave, and working as a secretary to an Indian opium trader. Not this one, but someone not unlike him. During his time there, Neal made many friends, including a Cantonese translator whose English name was Compton. In Flood of Fire, Neal returns to Canton and is offered a job in a newly established Bureau of Translation that has been set up by Lin Zezhu, the governor of Guangdong province. Neal accepts and moves into a houseboat, perhaps a little like this one, which is owned by a Cantonese family that has recently returned to China after spending many years in Bengal. He is given a room at the top of the houseboat and is delighted to find that it comes with a little veranda. This is a part of his entry in his journal for September 30th, 1839. The veranda was heaped with rotting beams, spars, and ropes. I stepped out gingerly, expecting another unwelcome surprise. Geese, maybe, or ducks. Instead, the panorama of the city burst upon me like a breaking wave. It was a clear day, and I could see all the way to Wu Hill, the ridge that overlooks Guangzhou. I could even see the great 5-story edifice at the hill's peak, the Zhenhai Lu, or sea calming tower. In the foreground, on the other side of the river, was the foreign enclave. The channel in between was crowded with vessels of many shapes and sizes. Swatow trading junks could be seen towering over rice boats and ferries, and everywhere one looked there were circular coracles spinning from one bank to another. I could not have asked for more. To step out on that veranda is to have a perpetual tamasha unfolding before one's eyes. At night, when darkness falls on the city, the river comes alive with lights. Many of Canton's famous flower boats float past my veranda, lanterns blazing, leaving behind sparkling wakes of music and laughter. Some of the flower boats have open-sided terraces and pavilions in which women can be seen entertaining their clients with song and music. Watching them, I can understand why it's said of Canton that young men come here to be ruined. The bureau that Neal works in is located just off Old China Street on 13 Hong Street, which bordered the old foreign enclave. It's the only part of the foreign enclave that still exists. Here is an excerpt from Neal's journal entry of November 18, 1839, shortly after it's become evident that the British had determined to find an excuse to launch an attack on China. Nowadays, Compton's fretfulness bubbles over quite often. In the past, his attitude towards translation was fairly matter of fact. But now it is as if language itself had become a battleground, with words serving as weapons. He sometimes explodes with indignation while reading British translations of official Chinese documents. Look, Anil, look how they've changed the meaning of what was said. He disputes everything, even the way the English use the word China. There is no similar term in Chinese, he says. The English have borrowed it from Sanskrit and Pali. The Chinese use a different expression, which is mistakenly represented in English as Middle Kingdom. He says that it's better translated as the Central States. I suppose it's the equivalent of our Indian Madhya Desha. What makes Compton angriest is when the Chinese character yi is translated as barbarian. He says that this character has always been used to refer to people who are not from the Central States. What it means, in other words, is foreigner. Apparently, this was not disputed until recently. Americans and Englishmen were quite content to translate yi as foreigner. But of late, some of their translators have begun to insist that yi means barbarian. It has repeatedly been pointed out to them that the word has been applied to many revered and famous people in China, even to the present ruling dynasty. But the English translators contend that they know better. Some of these translators are notorious opium smugglers. They're clearly twisting the Chinese language in order to make trouble. This drives Compton to despair. How can they pretend to know Anil? How can they claim to know that the picture they see when they say barbarian is the same that we see when we say yi? It's all a pack of lies. Thinking about this, I realized that I too would protest if Sanskrit or Bangla words like Yavana or Jobon were translated as barbarian. I think Compton is right when he says that the English use this word. The reason the English use this word is because it is they who think of us as barbarians. They want war, so they're looking for excuses, and even a word will do. Thank you.
That was a bit of British colonial identity politics,
Yes.
we were saying. So you've gone on quite a journey with these characters. If I read correctly, you started the Ibis trilogy 10 years ago, and the 3 books are about 2,600 pages. You must have gotten to know these characters and to know the history of these events very well. I was wondering if you could talk about kind of how you started this series, why you decided on this context, and how the books change as you went along, because it's not a conventional trilogy where each book ends at point B and picks up the next place. It seems more like you're inventing a world, and then the characters roam around, and you might not necessarily know what happened.
Well, that's quite well put, actually. Actually, it's taken me more than 10 years. It's almost 11 years.
Wow.
Yeah, I started towards the end of 2004. My earlier book, The Hungry Tide, came out in 2004, and I started work on this, in that period between books, as it were. Yes, I knew sort of like 6 months into writing the books that one book wouldn't be enough, that these characters really interested me so much that I wanted to stay with them for a really long time. And, the way that I thought of the trilogy really was on the analogy of a set of books that made a huge impression on me when I first read them. This is Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet. And those of you who've read it will know that, those books are also sort of tangentially related to each other. That the relationship is not linear. It's a non-linear relationship, really. It's more like the bits of a Rubik's Cube, the way that they fit together. So that was the way that I thought of it. And yes, you're right. I think one of the great pleasures of writing fiction is, if you like, world building, and it was literally like conjuring up a lost world.
Yeah, I felt like the books are like a succession of you inventing these like pockets of social environments, like a milieu like the ship or the prison, or in this book, the military, the context of the military. And, as any student of British history in India knows, it's a sort of unique circumstance where the British can have the army pay for itself, through the Indian tax base. And what's curious about it is this way where the Indian army is sort of like also the invader in the other spaces, in China, but in other places like Egypt or Uganda or Ethiopia, Persia, Tibet. And you have so many scenes in this book where you kind of lovingly describe what it's like to be a sepoy, what it's like to, have a wrestling pit, or to what are the career advancement prospects in the army. And I was wondering if you could talk about what your research process was like around that as a place. What did you find the most fascinating about it?
Well, the strange thing really about colonial India is that, essentially India was a garrison state. It was held by the army. It was held by the British Army. It was held at the point of the sword. And certainly the British who were in India at the time understood this perfectly well, that it was essentially a military regime. And in that sense, really, the true heir to the British colonial state is Pakistan, which in fact inherited half the British Indian Army. The curious thing, though, is that, in the 20th century, the British actually were very, very skilled at disguising this reality, because the army was systematically segregated from the civilian population. The people who were in the army came from certain designated areas, certain designated castes, and they were quite strictly segregated from, other parts of the society. So it was very easy for ordinary people to actually not be aware of the army that was around them at all times, And yet this army could be deployed with astonishing speed, when necessary. And as you say, this army conquered, fought many battles outside India, but most of all it fought battles inside India. it conquered India, for the British. Curiously, though, today there's very little written or very little interest really in the history of the British Indian Army. I mean, say on this early period, that is to say the pre-1857 Indian Army, the literature is actually quite astonishingly thin, considering that this is the central fact of 19th century Indian history. And I think this must have something to do with, Gandhiism and the whole sort of, as it were, a sort of revisionist idea of Indian history, where India is presented as something quite different from this. But really, the army was the central reality of historical reality of Indian life, and so actually, to recreate this experience is not easy. It's very, very difficult. And one of the reasons why it's very difficult is because, in this entire period from about the 1760s, when the British Indian Army is formed, until let's say 1900, literally millions of Indians fought in the British colonial armies, millions. And yet, we have only one first-hand account of service in the British Indian Army. And even that account is actually apocryphal. It's said to have been dictated by an Indian subedar to an English officer, but the text has never been found. So, but that continues. I mean, if you look at the First World War, very many more Indians fought in the First World War than Americans. I think it was like, it's more than 2.5 times as much, about 1.5 million Indians were in the First World War. Now, the First World War was incredibly fecund in literature, I mean, the war poets in England, but I mean, not just that, I mean, Germany, France, everywhere, people were just pouring out stuff about the... If you look at the 1.5 million Indians who were involved in the First World War, we still have, fewer first-hand accounts than can be counted on one hand, And, strangely, very few of these even fewer were actually written by soldiers. Most of these are by medical personnel or auxiliaries of various kinds. Actually, a couple of them, two of the most important, I think, were written in Bengali. And I've translated large sections of them on my website, so anyone who likes can go and have a look at it. But they're fascinating documents, and I think these two accounts count among the very greatest First World War literature. But, they were self-published, nobody knew them. There's one copy in the National Library in Calcutta, which I fortunately managed to Xerox. So, there you are. So, the paucity of material on the Indian experience.
Did it make it harder to kind of reimagine that?
It's incredibly hard. Yeah, it was incredibly hard to imagine what the texture of life was like. And you can be sure that it was completely different from anything that we today think of as the army. For example, in the pictures that I showed you, you will have seen this figure of Pagla Baba. So, the military tradition in India was very much centered on these figures of mendicants, sadhus and peers, and they played a very large part, especially militant sadhus, and they were, many of them, incorporated into the army, even into the colonial army, much against the wishes of British officers, but the Indian soldiers wanted it. So there was this strange sort of kind of spiritual dimension to serving in the army. And in trying to really imagine what the life of an Indian soldier was like in the 19th century, I feel certain, I mean, those of you who know First World War literature will know that, it was filled, all war literature really is filled with visions and visitations and so on, The famous one from the First World War is the Angel of Mons. An angel is said to have appeared over the battlefield, and the angel allowed the British and French troops to withdraw. And, it was very, very, Whether an angel actually appeared, who can say? But it was certainly a very powerful element of belief. And that was by no means the only case. I mean, I think, soldiering is a circumstance where people are in extremis, and people see things, they have visions, they have ideas. And, I feel certain that if Indian soldiers had actually written about the wars or the lives that they had led, they would be completely different from what we think of as like English war narratives.
Well, I feel like in the military scenes in the book, you're so good at depicting these dual cultures that are sort of overlaid, where, when you read Niall Ferguson or someone like that say that the colonizers brought individuality, what you really see is they brought discipline, whereas the soldiers are sort of like, there's no more heroism, you can't even duel, everyone dresses the same. I wanted to ask you about sort of what it means to write a political novel, because the books have a lot of politics, but there's never any point where it's like agitprop. There are a few points where, for example, where you say that the British invasion of China is, one of the great iniquities of world history. But what's kind of marvelous about the book is how, in a way, a lot of the main characters are like the bad guys in terms of history, in that they are profiting off the opium trade, or they're the soldiers that are invading China. And I think what's interesting about the book is these sort of layers of irony and ambiguity. It's political without a kind of moralism to it. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what it means to write characters that are sympathetic in terms of reading the plot and caring about how they're doing the story, but maybe not politically.
Everything is gone off. Yeah, that. We're back. I think one of the really astonishing things to me is that one of the great fans of these books is Robert Kagan, a neoconservative, and he's written. He's written he's really praised the books, and he says, they're very objective and this and that. So, look, the problem in relation to, say, politically looking at this situation is that the British project succeeded. In fact, the model of economy that India now embraces and that China now embraces is this incredibly destructive, extractive form of capitalism. I don't know if you can even call it capitalism. It's just extraction, for its own sake. So, in that sense, the project was successful, And I'm really writing about a 19th century circumstance where you might say that the whole, the Enlightenment invention of politics hasn't yet occurred. And I myself look upon that idea of politics, having written these books. I suppose most of all what it's made me do is to think of that idea of politics as really one of the many profound deceptions that are put into place in this period.
How do you mean?
Well, what is this politics that we think about, really? I'm sure you know Bruno Latour's argument about
we were never modern.
We were never modern, and the whole thrust of modernity is towards what he calls purification, that is, a consistent separation of nature and culture. And I think this is actually what this politics is, what its real aim and intention is that this absolute segregation of nature and culture, which is why it has so utterly failed in relation to climate change.
You're writing about climate change right now.
I am, yes.
Maybe switching to the other side, the book often luxuriates in kind of heteroglossia. There's so many different languages. I think at one point I counted up to 8, 9, or 10 languages from, Hindustani, Bengali, Telugu, but also Cantonese and Mauritian Creole, and the kind of fusions of different kind of languages. It's almost like, I think James Joyce once said in writing a chapter in Finnegan's Wake where there are all the rivers in the world, he wanted everyone in the world to be able to read the book and recognize the river by their town. And, I was wondering, did you have favorite words that you encountered when you were researching? And what was the fun of it like to kind of collage everything together?
Oh yeah, it was endless fun. I mean, that was the part of the book that I enjoyed the most. I see, when I started writing the books, I felt that I have to give a sense of the incredible variety and multilinguality of this Indian Ocean region. And actually, the deeper I got into it, the more and more exciting it was. But you speak of many languages, and I suppose, in a sense, if you approach language from the point of view of standard languages, as a lexicographer might, it appears as such. But you have to remember that in the 1830s, 1840s, this is long before the major dictionary projects. So there was no standard English, there was no standard Bengali, there was no standard version of any of these languages. And in fact, I think, in a sense, language was much freer. Language was certainly one of the great joys of writing these books is that I had to read a lot of 19th century journals and so on, often written by young English officers and so on. And at this point in time, there's no standard punctuation, there's no standard spelling. And they write these wonderful sentences, which go on for a page after page. These sentences written with incredible fluency, And I think, if you ask me, that the whole standardization projects destroyed language, with all this over-punctuation and over-standardizations of spellings and so on. So I try to use, I'm not a lexicographer, I'm not in the business of dictating what language should be. I don't take a prescriptive view of language, So for me, it's, language is what it is. It's the sea I swim in. And that sea, just like you can't keep apart the waters of the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic, in those waters, all the currents flow together.
I was thinking maybe we can take some questions from the audience at this point. Or you can think about it and I'll ask another question.
There's a question.
Oh, yes, right here.
So, it's a pleasure to sort of speak. It's a wonderful book. You earlier mentioned that there's a sort of a glossing over this period in time when this British Indian Army existed, which is a bit of a contradiction to nationalism in the following century. And there's a chapter in the book where Singh is choosing, his brother's choosing which army to join, his father's positioning and getting pitched, as we call it. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that comment which you made earlier on sort of the Gandhi period of sort of nationalism as it came out, and sort of your research that you did of this period? In fact, there's no sense of Indian nationalism at all. You're thinking of the way people spoke.
Oh, certainly. There was no nation at that point. Early modern India, let's say 17th, 18th century India, is really this sort of congeries of small states. And, several military historians of this period now argue that, in fact, what was driving Indian history in this early modern period was actually the institution of the military labor market, which was centered in this area, in this Gangetic region. So say the young men of Bihar, of Awadh, of Rajasthan, essentially, they were selling their labor power on a military market. And whoever could control this market essentially controlled, the heart of India. So Sher Shah Suri, for example, the argument goes is that he established control. Remember, Sher-Shah Suri comes out of Bihar, you know, and the argument goes that he established control over northern India simply by taking control of the labor market, you know, the military labor market in this region. So India of this period is really a society of adventurers. You know, several historians have actually made the argument, Jos Gumans, for example, that the India of the early modern period is actually the most diverse society in the world. It's just filled with adventurers of various tribes: Portuguese, English, Afghans, Russians. You know, all sorts of people have arrived there just in order to join these armies. You know, and these armies are mercenary armies. You know, they join, you know, whoever pays them. And that has been the model of, I mean, that was the model of Indian armies forever. So that is the model that the British used, you know, in recruiting the sepoys. Because they recruited the sepoys quite straightforwardly as a mercenary army. There was never any question of the sepoys, you know, being officers or having command, or even of having any great, you know, loyalty or faith to any particular institution. So, you know, it's a very, very curious situation, and this situation continued really until the First World War. I mean, the Indians in the First World War were still really recruited on the model of a 18th century mercenary army, you know. So, what happens with nationalism? Indian nationalism, the way especially that Gandhi inherits it, and the spin that, and the way that Gandhi reinvents an idea of India, how shall I say, as a non-violent civilization, as a civilization which is sort of, you know, I think there is a lot to be said for that invention, you know. But the reality is, that this is in no way does it correspond, you know, to what early modern India was, or what even India was in imagination. I mean, you think of the two major Indian epics. I mean, the Mahabharata is absolutely blood-soaked, you know. I mean, really, if you read it, it's not shy about it. It's like, it's blood, 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 you know, killing. And similarly, the Ramayana is, you know, it's again about essentially a military adventure, you know. So, what actually happens is very interesting and curious that, you know, in the late 19th, early 20th century, Gandhi understands that, you know, you cannot beat the British militarily, because that was tried in 1857. It came very close to winning, but it lost, you know. So he and several other major nationalists then decide to take this other turn, you know. And then they do create this other mythology of, you know, non-violence in India. And when I say it's a mythology, it's not entirely mythological. India is so multifarious that you can draw upon many, many traditions at any given moment. But, and I think, you know, on the whole, Gandhi's recasting of this has served us well, in the sense that, you know, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that India was never in danger of being taken over by the army or anything. I mean, that's really never been a possibility. Whereas that has been very much a possibility in Pakistan, also Bangladesh, you know. So there's a lot to be said for it. You know, I'm not as it were castigating it. But what does surprise me is that academic historians, you know, who are not necessarily sort of, you know, beating the drums for the army or anything, why they neglect this area, you know.
There's a question over here. Yes.
Talking about academic historians, one of the great values, my training is in the history of the Middle East, and I always recommend your books to my students because there's a way, and I see a historian in you, I see a great deal of interest in history and very meticulous research, but also your stories tell talk about colonialism and its spread and capitalism in a way that academic historians have great difficulty in doing, or don't do as in as human a form as you do. I'm specifically talking about the opium, the way the British somehow, in various areas, in the Ottoman Empire, in Iran, and in but this is a great value that I see in the books, how well it expresses these historical facts. Also, the shifting of the labor. This was also a period where the British were abolitionists, abolitionism, and slavery was discouraged, but then a lot of people were shifting into the British shipyards and the labor markets in India that the British needed. And these are little, they're huge historical trends that are very important to look at. But I just wanted to show my great appreciation of your books as historical representations.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, that's very generous of you, and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. I mean, see, opium really accounted for a very large part of the Indian economy through the 19th century and well into the 20th. Maybe as much as 50% of the Indian economy, you know, if you consider ancillary industries like shipping and so on. And yet, you know, there's not one comprehensive account of the opium economy in India. You know, not a single one. I mean, there's one about, you know, J.F. Richards wrote about opium in eastern India. Amar Farooqi has written about opium in western India, but there is no overall sort of account of it. And it's astounding, really. I mean, it's just like with the military thing. You know, it's like the history of India has been written as a set of bemusements, you know, to, as it were, screen the reality of you know, of the colonial world. It's bewildering. I mean, one just doesn't understand why it should be so. But I'm so happy to hear that you're writing this history of Turkey and Iran. I was recently, you know, at the old Roberts College, you know, Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, and I'm sure that this Roberts was an opium trader. You know, because actually the opium trade from Turkey was mainly conducted by Americans. You know, the Americans were the big investors in that. So it would be really interesting to see this, you know, this tapestry properly explored.
And I believe you said the last time we did this that this area actually was a port for the opium trade.
Oh yes, very much so. This particular area right here. Yeah, one of the great, some of the great opium traders were actually right on J Street. You know, the Brooklyn Harbor nearby. Yeah. There's a family called the Low family, LOW, and they were very much involved in the opium trade. And they were a J Street family.
Right here.
I just started reading Flood and Fire, and I just had a quick question. Was there any particular reasoning behind the inclusion of the almost bodice ripper-like romance between Zach and Mrs. Burnham?
You know, that was their trajectory. And, you know, we were talking earlier about language, and in each of the books, I've really enjoyed exploring different aspects of language, you know. In the first one, it was the sailing language. In the second one, it was business language. And in this one, I wanted to explore the erotic dimension of language. And, you know, one of the really interesting aspects of Victorian English is how rich it is in euphemism, you know. So, you know, I really wanted to explore the sort of euphemistic power of language, if you like. And if you look at the book, you'll see that, in fact, everything that happens between them lies purely in linguistic suggestion. There's nothing other than that. So if it seems to you like these are scenes which are actually described, then I think it has served the purpose. You know, because actually nothing is. You know, it's all purely the power of euphemistic suggestion.
Yeah, those euphemisms seemed kind of Shakespearean in how kind of flowery yet kind of body they were at the same time. They must have been great fun to write.
Yes, certainly.
In the back.
Hi, I heard you speak about 2 or 3 years ago in LSD, and then we were discussing the Lascar as an ephemeral but very real brown presence on the margins of society. And today we're discussing the sequoia. But what connects both of them for me is the uprootedness as well as the cosmopolitanism within these groups. Do you think that's the reason why you are rewriting these Victorian histories for us today? You're filling in the blanks that these ephemeral groups, which were uprooted and thus could not be spatialized and narrativized, have to be rewritten today. I don't know, that's just how I think
I think I'm not quite as advanced in my thinking as you are, to be honest. I like the stories of Lascars and Sepoys because they interest me, you know. I think they led very, very interesting lives. And I think Lascars especially were really in every way the forerunner of today's IT professionals, if you like. I mean, you know. I mean, they were really the first South Asians to adapt to Western work rhythms, you know, to Western modes of industrial production, you know, with these 4-hour time cycles. They were the first Indians to actually live in very close quarters, you know, with Westerners. And they were the agents, I think, who actually introduced a very large range of words, Western words into the Indian vocabulary, you know. So, for example, if you consider, you know, a word like, let's say, balti, you know, which is such a common Indian word. Balti is actually from a Portuguese word, and it really refers to a ship's bucket, you know. So it comes through this Lascar route, or say banyan, you know, which most Indian males wear. You know, I mean, it also meant initially a sort of T-shirt that sailors wore. You know, so if you look at the sort of contribution that Lascars have made to you know, to Indian culture, it's inestimable, really. I mean, and yet it's completely invisible. You know, so that certainly does interest me very, very much.
Over here.
I'm
Where?
very curious to know how many languages you actually speak. Are you fluent?
It depends on at any given moment in time. I mean, at various moments in time, I would say I've been, English and Bengali are languages that I'm absolutely fluent in all the time. But there's also Hindi, then there's Arabic and French, both of which I spoke reasonably fluently at various points in time.
The reason I ask is because I've been reading the books. There's almost a poetic texture to it, and I was just fascinated by the language and your use of the language. I was also curious as to whether, did you make up words?
Very rarely. I hardly ever made up a word. I didn't need to, you know, because these words actually existed and were in use. I mean, you know, I happen to really enjoy reading dictionaries. So, I found a lot of dictionaries, and you know, going through the dictionaries, most of these words are actually available. I mean, they were in use. They were a part of common usage. And as I said, you know, in the 19th century, there were no standard languages. The ways in which, let's say, English people spoke in England, you know, we don't know how they spoke exactly, but we do know that, for example, Dutch people in Java, within one generation, their first language would be Malay. You know, I don't think it exactly happened like that in India, but we do know that most of these English people who lived there were brought up by, you know, Indian servants and so on. So like Rudyard Kipling, who apparently spoke no English at all until he was 4 or 5, you know. most of them would have been completely fluent in Indian languages. So there would have been a natural melding of languages, just as there is in my head, I mean, growing up bilingual and multilingual as I did in India, to me there's a sort of seamless, there's a continuum, if you like, between languages. Thank you.
You've done a lot of touring for this book, and you've gone to Singapore, and we were talking about you visiting Guangzhou. So wondering, in East Asia or in China, is the reaction to the book different, or how do they view this as a reflection of Chinese colonial history?
The books had a wonderful reception in China. I mean, the first two books are already in Mandarin and simplified and complex Chinese. And they've had wonderful reviews. One major Chinese review actually said this is the first proper Asian perspective on the Opium Wars.
Question right here.
Yeah, so my dad is a huge fan of the trilogy,
Oh, that's
and he
nice.
wanted me to ask you a question about the Cantonese in it. He says that it's very contemporary. He wanted to know your research process about the Cantonese and if that's truly how it was spoken back then.
And I was also wondering, looking at the sources, were there a lot of Chinese accounts of the Opium War? It seemed like you looked at a lot of British officer logs, but I'm curious on terms of the Chinese side, what was that like?
See, I don't read Chinese, so obviously I couldn't look at the entire corpus of Chinese writing on the First Opium War, which is, I believe, huge. But fortunately, many major sources are in translation, so I could look at all of those. But your question about Cantonese is a very interesting one. I know this wonderful linguist, he's actually an Englishman who lives in Hong Kong, and he's written a wonderful book on Cantonese slang. And of course it is contemporary Cantonese slang, but I think Cantonese as a language, I did make some effort to acquaint myself with Cantonese. Cantonese as a language has always had this slangy, street-see quality with incredibly rich in obscenity and, I'm sure it had that then. And a lot of the stuff that people, that English and Indians were upset about in those days is being called various names, translated, if you like, as, red-headed demon or, black devil and so on. But I think what is not appreciated really is that in Cantonese, there's this whole sort of poetry of denigration, which is also applied between Chinese people. Someone will use it of the next village, or or people from the next province. So I mean, it's like if you, this whole sort of rhetoric of obscenity, curse words, denigration, and so on. And I think it's sort of incredibly rich, that field of Cantonese. Mind you, once you begin to understand a few words in Cantonese, you suddenly realize that most of the time they're really just talking about money.
Here.
Just curious about the reception of your book in India, especially given the fact when you started 10 years ago versus now. There's now a huge explosion of Indian writing, which is very different from the type of books you've written. Like 10 years ago, a lot of it was more literature-oriented. Now there's a lot of popular, more simpler, but widely read books. And how has that impacted your audience? Are you seeing more people reading your books or less? Because it's very, very different style and very different kind of audience that the new English books that are coming out are targeting in India.
I think it's entirely positive. I think it's entirely positive that people are writing different kinds of books. Amish Tripathi is a good friend of mine. Chetan Bhagat came to the release of my book in Bombay, which was lovely. I think they're bringing new readers into into reading. I just don't see the downside of it, and I don't see why, they get so much flack. It just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, in any healthy publishing industry, there are many varieties of writing. I mean, that someone writes, crime fiction doesn't in any way, take away my slice of the pie or whatever, you know. So, I mean, I just think it's all plus. I mean, you know, it's not necessarily the case that I would read all these new books, but, you know, I don't see what's to, you know, what's to run down in it either.
I have a follow-up question about the language here. So everyone's talking about all these different dialects, like Hindustani, Cantonese, and Bengali. I just wonder, in the process of writing, are you thinking at all about the reader's reading experience? Because I think most of us aren't fluent in 19th century Hindustani. And I wonder, do you get the sense that sometimes there are things that are lost in that reading experience? And there's no glossary or anything like that.
That's a good question. You know, let me answer it in multiple ways. One is that, yes, of course, I don't want to write a text that nobody can understand. But, fortunately, language has this wonderful dimension called redundancy. So, I mean, you can construct a sentence building in redundancies, I think anyone who reads contextually will have no difficulty understanding any sentence in my book. You can just extrapolate from the context what it is. Secondly, what exactly are we proposing here? I mean, we're proposing then that a complete theory of transparency in language. That language should be absolutely transparent. It would be the other position, But is language ever absolutely transparent? Certainly that was not my experience of reading English. I mean, as a child when I was reading, let's say, children's books, or even reading, reading American books, I had no idea what a hot dog was, or a macaroon, or, stuff like that. And, if I'd looked up the dictionary, I mean, you can look up a dictionary and macaroon is described, but in what way does it really tell you about what a macaroon is? I mean, you really cannot know, I mean, that's just an absolute barrier of language, if you like. And at the same time, in no way was it a barrier. I mean, I realized that these are things that they eat, and then you just keep reading. I mean, really, in what way does that in any way disrupt your reading experience? Thirdly, I'll say, I think that a novel, when you enter a novel, you're entering a space, a certain space which is not your everyday world. And one of the ways in which we recognize the difference of that space is through a kind of white noise, And this is literally just a white noise which is in the background. But this white noise signals to you that you're not in Kansas, if you like, that you're somewhere else. It's in some other space that you've entered. And this white noise need not be significant in communicative terms. What it's doing is something else. See, the way that language works in a novel is not the way that it works in, say, journalism or nonfiction. It doesn't exist primarily for the conveying of information, Every word in there is simultaneously conveying shades of emotion. It's suggesting locations. It's suggesting, so there's a multivalency to language, if you like, within a novel. And that's what you get, when you enter certain spaces. You suddenly realize that you're surrounded by these sounds which are not everyday sounds, and that they exist for some other reason. If you compare us with, say, film directors, directors have access to, sound and music and so many other things. We have only words, So why should we restrict ourselves only to the words that any specified reader will understand? That, I mean, our whole project would become so impoverished, wouldn't it?
I felt like it was like action painting.
If you like.
There's one question.
Yes.
Questions back, you talked about how invisibly foreign imports have been integrated into Indian culture. You use words as one example of that.
Sorry? Yes.
You use words as language as one
Yeah.
example of that. It reminded me of something I learned recently, which was that
Oh, well, food is a great obsession of mine, so I'm always happy to talk about food. But let me tell you something, it's quite interesting that actually, as you say, tomatoes and chilies and so on have become completely integrated into Indian food. But if you try making an offering in a temple, you can't include tomatoes or potatoes or, what we call red potatoes and so on. Because that whole category of New World vegetables is not considered acceptable offerings for the gods. So at somewhere, somebody, it is remembered, it's recalled that these are foreign, But other than that, yes, they've become completely integrated into Indian food. And I often wonder what was used in the place of chilies before. In my house in India, I grow pepper, black pepper. And I can tell you that actual black pepper, home cured, sun dried, is actually nothing at all like what you buy in a market, And I think it does have that complexity of taste, which was, so I think pepper possibly was, what was used before that. But again, chilies became a different kind of substitute for it.
Right here.
Return to the point you made about how invisible the opium trade was when we were writing about the history of it, about the great Bengali and Parsi families who made their fortunes in opium and how invisible it is. Now, when you read the stories from that time, when you read Tagore, for instance, there is no reference to the fact that about opium, despite the fact that the Tagore family was obviously built around opium trade. Is that, do you think, is it because you were even then taking a model, or were they shying away from talking about it because they were taking a model stance on it, or is it just because of the fact that there was a tradition about writing on it?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, of course, the Tagore family was, Darukannath Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore's grandfather, was a pioneering opium trader, But, what's very interesting is that actually Tagore did write about opium a lot. He was actually quite obsessed with opium. And I can just show you, in shorter writings, he talks about Indian opium as a dagger pointed at the heart of the Chinese. He constantly refers to this, how, this is the greatest shame of our nation and so on. And Tagore, he had this very profound antipathy towards his grandfather, towards Darukannath Thakur. And I think opium probably had a great deal to do with it. But it is very interesting that Tagore is one of the people who constantly returns to opium. Another person who constantly returns to opium is Dadabhai Nauroji. And again, he's a Parsi. So he had a first-hand acquaintance of what opium meant. So again, he addresses it all the time. But apart from that, we don't, I think, adequately recognize the degree to which opium changed India. For example, if you look at the great influx of merchants from Western India into Eastern India and specifically into Calcutta, it was all around opium. The great Marwari migration into Calcutta, the building of these great Marwari fortunes in Calcutta was all around opium speculation, speculation on opium futures. Similarly, Bombay was absolutely, as Amar Farooqi has written, it was founded on opium. To this day, you look at every major old Indian fortune, all of it is ultimately traceable to opium. And by no means only the Parsis, every major Indian trading community was deeply involved in opium, as they had to be, as indeed was the case here. All the major American industrial, American wealth, at some level was involved with opium. The great railroads of the American West were financed, actually directly financed by Chinese merchants, and by opium traders. So essentially what we call the Boston Brahmins, they were actually, all of them were opium traders, You look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His family money came from his grandfather, Andrew Delano, who was one of the biggest opium merchants in Canton. The same is true of the Calvin Coolidge family. It's true of the Forbes family. It's, half the educational institutions of the East Coast were financed with opium. You know, so. I mean, it's not even, it's not like it's a hidden thing. You go to Brown University, they'll show you this big plaque saying the founder made his money in the slave trade and opium trade. So it's not, it's hardly a secret. But somehow it's not talked about. You know, that's the strange thing about it. It's not that the material isn't there. It's not that any of this is unknown. It's just that, you know, it's an uncomfortable subject that people don't bring up.
Why don't we do one last question?
I just wanted to return to the question of language and, you know, this active translation. How does, and you know, from reading, you reference the detrimental power of translation. And I'm wondering, as a writer, you know, how does your novel space, how do you in this theater, can you think about how your novel space gets mitigated in the active translation? So you said your book was received well in China, but is it exciting possibilities of new currents of people's interpretations of your text, or are there inhibitions, or do you have any collaboration with translators?
I work very closely with some of my translators. It actually depends on the translators. The translators who reach out to me, and you know, I work very closely with my Italian translator is a dear friend, and I've been working with her now for the entirety of my writing career. You know, the same is true of my French translator. Similarly, my Russian translator always sends me a lot of questions. My Bulgarian translator does, but never my Spanish or German translators. My Chinese translator sends me a lot of questions, and I know him very well, really, and you know, he's become a good friend. So I think, you know, translation opens up many possibilities. I translate a lot myself, you know, so it's something I enjoy doing, and you know, that's a pleasure for me. So, you know, so it's impossible for me, of course, to know what the quality of a translation in some other language is. But I do think it opens up many possibilities.
Well, it seems like the books are informed by this like cross-translation space where you have different languages intersecting. But when the books are in Russian or Chinese, what happens to that multi-linguistic quality? Like when characters speak Chinese interrupting the English text, what happens in the Chinese?
I really don't know. But you know, that's why it's very interesting to work with my Chinese translator, because you know, for certain Cantonese words, he'll say, "Is that the right character?" And then I have to go back to the dictionary and figure out and say, "No, that's not the character. This is the character." And from that, you know, we try and work backwards. And it is very difficult because a lot of these Cantonese expressions are actually, I suppose, not common in Mandarin. But again, you know, I think it has to be creative. You know, I mean, my Italian translator, I know, often uses many Italian dialects. You know, also uses you know, Italian pidgins and Italian nautical language. So every language has its own resources, you know, that you can draw upon to enrich the text. It only has to be done creatively, I think.
Well, I think I speak for everyone in saying how wonderful and thoughtful and enlightening it was to listen to you. So let's all give Amitav a hand.
Thank you.
A few quick last things. I want to thank Nadia, who staffed this event, Rob, who's on the camera, all the interns and volunteers, Jyoti, who edits the margins. And if you go to the margins now, you can see a video of Amitav talking about the first two books, as well as, I think, the opening pages of this book. I also want to thank Word Up for selling books, which is, of course, the cue to go out and buy all the books and have a glass of wine. So please read the margins at AAWWTV.org, come to our other events, and thank you for coming on a rainy night.